Hello all, welcome to today's event, Stitching History, the Afro-American Heritage Bicentennial Commemorative Quilt. Today's event will be a panel discussion with quilt historians and moderated by Sheridan Collins. So before we go on, well, first let me introduce myself before I forget. My name is Isa. I am the Education and Programs Coordinator at the Oregon Historical Society. So some ways that you can get involved in the Oregon Historical Society is by signing up for our newsletters. We send out newsletters about every 2 weeks. And we do have a newsletter that's designated specifically for educators if you're interested. Another way that you can get involved and stay up to date about our programs, our trainings, our blog posts is by following us on social media. And the Oregon Historical Society is a 501c3, which means that we do rely on gifts, especially right now during the time of COVID-19. And gifts can take many different forms, such as sharing our content on social media, giving a donation, or renewing your membership or becoming a member. And with membership comes perks. I'm going to touch briefly upon an upcoming program for the Hatfield Lecture Series. The upcoming lecture series will be given by Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. In addition to being a professor at Harvard University, Dr. Gates has authored and co-authored about 22 different books. He's been involved in about 18 different films. He really is a powerhouse scholar. I highly recommend checking out his work and checking out this program. Tickets for members range from $25 to $75. If you are a non-member, your ticket will range from $30 to $80. We do have a special for educators and students, which will drop the price for the tickets down to $10. This event will be occurring later this month on Tuesday, October 27th from 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. And with your ticket, you get access to the recording for the program in case you are not able to attend it the day of. So access is limited to 30 days afterwards, and we would just like to thank Dr. Gates for allowing us to give that access for afterwards. If you do bump up your individual ticket to a reserved or Patreon level, then you will also have access to the reflection roundtable that will be occurring towards the end of the month on October 29th. And in fact, one of our panelists for today, Dr. Thompson, will also be partaking in this reflection roundtable. Highly recommend coming to this program. A quick note on Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. The New York Times referred to this particular book as, an indispensable, well, I lost my notes. It's a highly praised book. Okay, I just wanted to give a quick land acknowledgement. As we all know, this past Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day. And although every day is a great day to learn about the original home carers of the land that you are on, Indigenous Peoples Day is a day specifically meant to honor Native American history and culture and to reflect upon the systems of oppression and violence that has shaped both Oregon history and specifically and the United States history at large. The Oregon Historical Society is located in downtown Portland, which is the traditional homeland of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tumwater, Wallala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kapuya, and many other indigenous nations that call the Columbia River their home. Up on the screen, you will see the nativeland.ca, which is a website that you can go to learn more specifically about the different territories, treaties, history, languages spoken in the area that you type into the URL function. This is a resource that is used in the Experience Oregon 3 through 5 curriculum, which we do have an upcoming training session on that curriculum that is being given by Sarah Anderson, who is the curriculum writer. There are PDUs available for educators who are interested, And this program will be occurring Wednesday on November 4th, 2020. So you can go to ohs.org/events to sign up for that. Okay, now on for the program. So this event is brought to you in partnership with the Portland Textile Month. Portland Textile Month is a textile festival that is occurring all throughout October. It consists of things such as virtual workshops, panel discussions like the one we are in today. And there are also different textile installations in different storefronts throughout Portland. The theme for this month's Portland Textiles is repair and reuse, which I love. It's definitely rooted in sustainability. You can find out more about the schedule and upcoming events by going to portlandtextilemonth.com. Okay, a quick note about what had happened at OHS on October 11th concerning the damage to the building and the taking of the quilt. This is a statement that you can find on ohs.org and on our social media platforms. It has also been given to the press, and this particular section is about what happened with the quilt. Earlier this week, we had a practice session for the panel discussion today, and I just wanted to quote something that one of our panelists said, Dr. Sylvia Gates Carlisle, who is one of the original quilters. She said, oftentimes it is the people who are the most critical who are also the most hopeful. And this comment that she made really resonated with me in particular. One of the reasons I love working at OHS is that we are a very self-aware institution. We acknowledge the fact that history museums on a whole have inherited a very violent legacy, and that it is our duty and responsibility to be held accountable for that legacy and to be held accountable for our community in the way that we represent our community and the way we represent Oregon history. And so I like to think that this quilt that had been given to the Oregon Historical Society back in the 70s, which was during a time when OHS did not have the particular values on diversity and multiculturalism that it currently has, that this quilt, which was made by 15 different Black Portland women to honor the legacy and contributions of different Black Americans, of different laws that were passed in order to fully recognize the contributions and dignity and humanity of the Black population in the United States, that this was given to the museum as a gift by these women. They had voted to give this to the History Museum. And I like to think that by giving this quilt to us, that it was a bit of kind of like planting a seed, a hope that the museum would someday become an institution that reflected the values of diversity, of the Black community, of multiculturalism, which is something that we are striving to do, though we are not perfect at. Now, on to the presenters for tonight, or today. So first up is Dr. Carmen P. Thompson. Dr. Thompson is an independent scholar and historian of race and the Black experience. Some of you might recognize Dr. Thompson. She was a co-editor and author of the Oregon Historical Quarterly's White Supremacy and Resistance in Oregon issue, which has been very well received locally here in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. She is currently working on a novel titled The Making of American Whiteness, which looks at the origins of whiteness in the United States. And then we have Mary Bywater Cross, who is a quilt historian. Mary's research really sees and treats quilts as visual records of the human experience. She has given lectures to a wide range of audiences, from experts at the Smithsonian to Oregonians in church basements. Her quilts on migration in particular have received national recognition, and listed on your screen, you will see some of the awards that he has received. So up next, we have Dr. Sylvia Gates Carlisle. She is the Director of Practice Management Curriculum at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine for the Family Medicine Residency Program, and is the Utilization Management Operations Medical Director at Beaver Medical Group. She is a descendant of activists on both sides of her family, and she is the last living member of the original 15 quilters who created the quilt that we will be discussing today. And finally, I would like to introduce our moderator for the day, Sheridan Collins. Sheridan Collins is on the advisory committee for the Portland Textile Month. She does work as a consultant, and she lectures frequently on antique carpets and textiles. And she did a lot of the behind the scene work to make today's event possible. And with that, I will hand things over to her.
Thank you, Isa. To recap here, I'll start with an introduction. In July 1976, 15 Portland women in a celebrated ceremony dedicated their newly created quilt to the past, present, and future of Black people in America. They'd worked for 2 years planning and creating the quilt, seeking a meaningful way to mark the 200th anniversary of the nation. The final result we see here, 30 patterned blocks framed by red, white, and blue striping, heralding in chronological order people and events in African-American history from 1492 through much of the 20th century. Quilts are common enough, and many were made in Oregon and around the country to mark the bicentennial. Why single out this quilt for discussion? The quilt has proved to be unique, as we'll see, for the quilter's broad goals and seriousness of purpose, a message of hope and patriotism in an era of serious racial strife. Let's see the photo of the quilters. The next screen, please. Who were the 15 quilters and what brought them together to create this quilt? What stories does the quilt embody? What was the significance of the quilt to Portland in 1976, and how does it speak to us today? I hope we'll answer all of these questions in the time we have. Dr. Gates Carlisle, let's start with you. You were the last one of the quilters to survive. Your mother, Jeanette McPherson, whom we see in this picture fourth from the left with someone's hand on her shoulder, came up with the idea of making the quilt in the first place. Just what was her purpose and how did she pull the group together?
My mother's purpose in the quilt was to counter a negative narrative that existed about Black people during the time I grew up in Portland. And so the negative narrative was foreign to her as someone from New Orleans. New Orleans, Louisiana is, known for Black excellence. And even in Oregon, although there were not many Black people were in Oregon from the beginning. And so the purpose of the quilt was to say, we are here and we contributed here. And that was the purpose of her getting other women who were active contributors to the Portland community together to make a statement piece.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Cross, you're a quilt historian. Tell us in simple terms what a quilt is and what makes this quilt so different from all the other quilts you've studied.
Well, this quilt is a classic from the 1970s, when during the bicentennial, many people were coming together to celebrate their communities, and quilts became one of those avenues of expression. And this quilt, as Mrs. Gates sought to have it, represented what was going on in what is now known as the democratization of America at the time, when people were making quilts and expressing their concern for government actions, to commemorate their national history, and to express their pride in their female ancestors. And the quilt has, of the 14 blocks celebrating personalities, 5 of those are women. And I think that was acknowledged clearly with the intent of Mrs. Gates to have the quilt be a national item, to have it be exhibited nationally, to have it be telling the story. It was part of an exhibit in which they brought together items, personal family heirlooms celebrating the African-American community in Portland. And they were in adjoining cases to this exhibition of the quilt. After the exhibition, those quilts were those items were returned to the families. The other item that exists that's really valuable is her documentation. There was a booklet that was written, which each quilt maker wrote a paragraph about the block and the person and why they chose that person and what their contribution was to American history, whether it was a personality, a national governmental act, whatever that is depicted on the quilt. They made a statement, and we historians love to have the documentation.
Thank you. Dr. Thompson, you're a historian of African-American history in America. Quilting's been largely a women's art, but what role did quilting play among African-American women to the extent it's had one?
Well, quilting just in general is a legacy within the Black community that kind of represented kind of a collective organizational network for the coming together of Black women of all different classes and backgrounds around a common issue, obviously, of women getting together. But kind of important to this quilt here, it really represents, you know, a consciousness of Black women and how it was that they saw the world. So while quilting is something that is a skill, it's an aesthetic, it's a cultural form, you know, within the Black community. More importantly, it was an opportunity for Black women to come together in a collective network to demonstrate their cooperation and interdependence upon one another across class lines, but also specifically to share and have a consciousness around their shared experiences with things that are going on in their community. And so when you look at this quilt, you could see kind of the consciousness of these Black women and thinking about it as a form of Black women's knowledge as to what it was that they saw was important, what was hopeful, and kind of mapping the contours of the Black experience, as well as of the white racism that had happened throughout American history into the present, and kind of setting up the framework of resistance and how it was that Black women were seeing the struggles that they were to face, but the opportunities as well of their position. So looking at it within the context of a consciousness, of knowledge, of resistance, and kind of understanding the challenges past and present and how they link together.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add
Ms.
to
Cross, I'd like to ask you specifically, yeah, we talked about education being key here. Mrs. Gates left quite a paper trail on the quilt, and it appears that the quilters had a larger agenda here from the beginning. Can you speak about their grander plan?
Well, one of the statements that Mrs. Gates made repeatedly was that this was our total effort of being approached from the perspective of a scholarly research project, not a vanity fair. No grants, dues, or other monies are associated with this invitational volunteer project. And the way she had organized the project was to have this group of women work together diplomatically, as she said, to make the decisions regarding who would be represented on the quilt and what they would represent in American Black history. And then they continued this tradition of voting and making group decisions all the way down to the point where it was decided that it would be part of the Oregon Historical Society collection.
She also made a point of promoting it. Can you speak to that?
Oh, she made a tremendous effort at promoting it. And that was one of the things that was included in her documentation. She approached museums and cities and universities across the country and in Canada to see if they would be interested in exhibiting the quilt. She wrote to the sites that were connected to the places on the quilt. For example, Fisk University in Nashville, or Mrs. Bogle having come from Philadelphia, from Pittsburgh. She wrote to those local newspapers to see if they would be interested in featuring the quilt in their collection or in their write-up or whatever. She even sent PR material to Walter Cronkite at CBS News.
Well, let's take a closer look at some of the blocks. Dr. Gates Carlisle, our eyes move right away when we see the quilt. Let's see, Asa, what have we got for the next shot? Well, we can see here in the black and white picture, there we go. Right smack in the center of the quilt, there's a clenched fist. Tell us how you chose the Emancipation Proclamation for your block and how you happened to choose that very charged design to represent it. We have a close-up of it too. Let's see, there we go.
I think my choice of the Emancipation Proclamation grew from my annual discipline as a child in Portland public schools. My mother would not let me sit in social studies and history during the month of February, so I spent that month every year for 10 years doing independent study. And so my independent study was on Black history, slavery, the abolitionists, and the emancipation. And so to me, a strong statement about a high watermark in Black history. And it wasn't that passive individuals were given the gift of freedom. It's that people achieved and won freedom.
So yours is followed by 3 blocks dedicated to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the so-called Reconstruction Amendments. Can we see the next 3, perhaps in sequence? There's the 13th, abolition of slavery. Next, the 14th, and there's civil rights to all. And then the next one, right to vote. So the 3 are stark for their absence of pictures. Dr. Thompson, as hard as they were to illustrate, still the quilt group insisted these were important subjects to consider. Why do you think that's the case?
Because they were relevant to our modern time. So abolition of slavery is really about the freedom of Black people. So even at the Bicentennial, as you know, Black people were still having to fight for freedom. They were still struggling for acceptance, for equality. And not just Black people, I want to really emphasize Black women and Black women's consciousness. So this quilt is representing the consciousness of these Black women who, when you talk about, say, the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, as well as the 14th Amendment with citizenship, there's a particular way that the Black women's experience kind of speaks to their separateness in some ways of Black men by gender and white women by race. And so they were kind of opening up us to their worldview, their consciousness, their knowledge about how it was that they saw the world and what Black women were understanding as what it was that Black people were trying to overcome. They were trying to continue to have freedom. They were trying to continue to have the right to vote. And they were trying to continue to have then the liberties under the law that the 14th Amendment talks about. So they're kind of mapping for us a level of consciousness and knowledge about how they saw the world and the importance of these things back from the 19th century and the relevance of those things in the 20th century as things to hope for, but yet marking a path of work that's yet to still to be done. And again, being specific, during this period of time, we still were in a period where systemic white racism against Black people was common. And so I think they were speaking to us to talk about the ways in which this systemic white racism against African-American people that dates back to slavery, as these amendments are talking about, are still present in the 1970s when this quilt was formed. And yet at the Bicentennial, they're talking about areas of then resistance, of hopefulness, of strivings that are still relevant in society. So they're kind of speaking kind of broadly to what is to be hoped for, what is to be strived for, and linking the past to the present as what historians do. So I think these women, their consciousness, their political and social consciousness, the knowledge that they have about the Black experience is very relevant in connecting the past to the present.
Mhm. Mary Cross, the quilt patterns, quilt blocks we've seen so far, all been shown with descriptions from the original pamphlet that was gifted with the quilt. How unusual is it for a story quilt to have text to accompany it like this?
Well, it all depends. The point I would like to make is that the use of stenciling on this quilt, on these blocks, that would have been common in the early 1970s in that time period, because there was not a lot of instruction available to these people as they were making the quilt. And so they each chose a technique that they were comfortable with, whether it was using a visual depiction of the person through applique or through the use of stenciling, as is clearly shown on this quilt. There's a long history of lettering being applied to quilts. It just depends upon what the intent is of the maker and what is she's wishing to express. And that's what's important here.
Mhm. Just one more note about the accompanying descriptions. They really are in depth for each one of the blocks. And it was specifically necessary, Jeanette Gates felt, to enhance the quilt by leaving this brochure for everybody to see. Dr. Gates Carlisle, your mother, Jeanette Gates, quilted 3 blocks, 2 of them about Frederick Douglass. Here's a picture of the block that depicts him. There we go. What did she want people to learn about him? And you're muted. There you go.
Frederick Douglass was an amazing man. The fact that he educated himself, freed himself, and then continued to fight to free others. He was an individual who, of course, supported the abolition of slavery and spoke against slavery, but he also supported women's suffrage, and that made him unusual for a gentleman of his time. And so he left a significant written record of his thoughts and his experiences, and he's a good role model for anyone to not only think of their own personal freedom, but to also be concerned about the rights of others.
Mm-hmm. The next block that we'll look at, block 11, depicts the railroad. It was quilted by Naomi Pennington Owens, who with Lila Phillips put more stitches into the quilt than any of the other women through the piecing and binding work. Dr. Thompson, the quilters wanted the railroads in this quilt. Jeanette Gates said it in a radio interview, as a tribute to the Black contribution to the opening of the West. What particular impact did the railroads have on African-American history in Portland?
Well, when you think about railroads and transportation, you think about the Black migration and how it was that large numbers of African-American and people of African descent coming to Portland and to the West for a better life and what that meant. So the circumstances around which they came for a better life was leaving the South, again, because of the white racism that they were facing, about the lack of jobs, the lack of opportunities for education, and just wanting to be able to make more money as they were kept out of certain jobs and certain positions, not able to be able to live and work as they wanted. Coming out to the West, as many people did, for more opportunities, still having those same struggles in the West, right? So a lot of people think just kind of leaving out of the South that everything was better. And it was better in the sense that there was more money and more opportunities, and the racism may not have been the same, but it still was there. And so I don't want us to kind of get this misnomer that just migration in and of itself and coming and leaving the South meant that the that the North or the West was better than the South. I would just say it was different. And so I think, again, getting back to Black women's consciousness about freedom, about movement, about opportunity, I think the railroads is kind of speaking to that. And of course, many of the Black people came out for jobs and worked not on the railroads, and those provided better jobs and better opportunities. But again, those opportunities were under the guise of white racism, locking Black people into certain types of jobs and certain types of positions, living in certain segregated neighborhoods. But Black people being who they are, and from a cultural standpoint of resistance and striving, took those opportunities and made the most of them in providing for their families and for their communities, and to be able to, kind of utilize that as a cause, or use their jobs and use their opportunities to press for better opportunities. So I think this quilt represents kind of this struggle and push forward against white racism, of migration, of movement forward, of advancement of Black people, but also representing, once again, the consciousness of Black women and the hope that they saw for Black people, and again, kind of connecting the past to the present.
Ms. Cross, the quilters that Jeanette Gates picked for this project brought a lot to the table. Half of them had college degrees or more. They had quilting skills, knowledge of their African-American heritage, and led active lives in the Portland community. Gladys McCoy is one example. Can you tell us something about Mrs. McCoy and the quilt block, which we can show here next, of Phyllis Wheatley? Thank you.
Yes, this is the quilt, one of the quilt blocks that Gladys McCoy made. You see her initials there on the bottom of the block. That was one of Mrs. Gates' instructions to her quilters: put your initials or your name on your block. Phyllis Wheatley was a slave who lived in Boston, and she was taught to read and write. And she published the first book of poetry done by an African-American woman. It was published in London. In the image on the quilt is taken from the image that her London publisher requested that be submitted to them to verify who she was. And I think it's a wonderful image. Mrs. McCoy went on to become the first Black woman in Portland to be elected to public office. She served in the Portland Public School Board for 8 years, on the Multnomah County Board of Commissioner for 6 years, and 7 years as the county chair. She made a significant contribution to Portland and to the citizens residing there. And the quilt blocks, this one, Phyllis Wheatley, and also the one Brown versus Topeka, was the second quilt block that Mrs. McCoy made.
So another of the quilters, Catherine Boyle, was a well-known journalist and social worker in Portland. Mary, can you tell us about her and what seems like a logical choice for one of her blocks, the integration of the armed forces in 1945? Next slide should have that. There we go.
Yes, Catherine Boyle was a significant player in Portland, and military history was significant for Blacks. Mrs. Bogle was a freelance journalist, and she was the first African-American to be paid for an article published in the Oregonian in 1937. She went on to become a community activist in Portland. She was the founder of Links, which was an educational and civic outreach group to promote equality within the area. This block represents the importance of participation in military services by Blacks throughout history. And it was done at the time marking 1945, the integration of all the armed forces.
Thank you. I might add that 8 years earlier, when she published that article, the article that she focused on was how difficult it was for Blacks in Portland. It was quite a time-breaking article. Dr. Thompson, we should all consider the quilt in context. The eve of the bicentennial, when Jeanette Gates and her friends came together to create a patriotic quilt, was actually a difficult time for race relations in Portland, as you've suggested. There was school busing and closing of some Black schools, raising of neighborhoods to make room for the expansion of Emmanuel Hospital, multiple allegations of police brutality and racism. Despite the breakthroughs of Gladys McCoy and others, some even called it the second Reconstruction era. This was a tough time for Black families. And you've suggested this, but how did African-American women navigate these difficulties facing both gender and color barriers?
The way that Black women have always done that, by creating organizational networks around these common issues of the Black experience, and trying to do their part to help advance the health and well-being of the Black community. So women have always come together as organizationally around the Black, helping Black people, whether it be in slavery, around slave culture and raising families and children and nurturing children and families in slave culture. During the Great Migration, they've always had women's clubs, women's organizations. This quilting circle that these women had is part of that. And so Black women have always kind of been a backbone of the community to be able to affect change and bring women together around these common things and issues. So they've, so just like you said, the women, Ms. McCoy and others, they were part of the Links. They were, had this quilting circle. They were involved in the churches, mutual aid societies, often through their business acumen, through the beauty shops, through education. They would often use their skills within these organizations to organize and kind of spur the community towards advancing Black rights, supporting Black organizations, both as women and as Black people. So they kind of, again, played this particular role from a gendered standpoint of advancing the cause of Black people through the organizations that they were involved in. And so again, this idea of this kind of collective network, this interdependence among women coming together around their shared experiences, both as women and both as part of the Black community, utilizing their organizational skills and their capacities within business and within art and culture to be able to kind of speak to the needs of the Black community and advance those needs through their organizational acumen.
Dr. Thompson, there's a tradition in this group. Some of the quilters like Ozella Canada, Lila Phillips, and Hazel Whitlow worked with the groups advocating African Americans like NAACP, Urban League, and the National Council of Negro Women. Others like Martha Payne, June Brown, and Mildred Reynolds volunteered in service groups like Jack and Jill, Links, and United Way. Or like Catherine Boyle, Sarah Mayfield, and Eddie Rollins worked as nurses or counselors. Then there was Mildred Love, who worked for the federal government. Gladys McCoy, the first Black elected to public office in Oregon. These were women who seemed to want to prove themselves as model citizens. Was this an effort to sort of act to persuade rather than to be aggressive about one's views?
Well, I mean, I just think Black women have always had a level of excellence in what they do and how it is that they want to affect change. So, all Black women's experiences are not the same. So across class lines, Black women have always used their position in the Black community to affect change. So whether it was the washerwomen back during the post-emancipation period, where they would organize themselves as women who were, washing the clothes of white women and organizing themselves into kind of a union to be able to demand better wages and better conditions, whether it was then women of Gladys McCoy and Ms. Vogel's era and Dr. Gates's moms and relatives who were into education and access whether it was women in the church of all class backgrounds. There's always been this interdependence among Black women of working around their common shared experiences of white racism and of aspects of gender discrimination, even within the Black community. Nonetheless, they have fought and utilized their quest for excellence and quest for advancement of Black people as a motivating force about the ways in which they've demanded change. So they're acknowledging within that experience that there's these common themes and common experiences, and women, regardless of class, were utilizing their either business experience, their collective, creating collective networks among Black women, have always kind of used wherever they were, the tools and the systems and the organizational skills, wherever they were, to kind of create change. So, and although the women of this quilting group were, kind of middle class and upper class Black women, they still were fighting within the context of what was important to them. So, there are these differences from a class standpoint, but I think the goals of how achieving them are the same, in that women are utilizing whatever skills and abilities that they have before them to create and advance change.
Mhm. Well, we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to move us towards some concluding thoughts before we take questions. Let's have the quilt up again, Isa, I think should be next. And then maybe the one after that. There we go. Dr. Gates Carlisle, your mother, you have said, fought against invisibility and in the community. And I wonder if you could say what that meant to her and whether this quilt speaks to that as an aid to helping us understand its value to us today.
The quilt's value is that it demonstrates that Black people were in Oregon for a long time, that they may have been small in number, but they were linked to a history and a culture and a legacy of excellence. And that these women acknowledged a narrative of negativity that was around them, but this is a concrete evidence of excellence, a concrete legacy of them being connected to a broader legacy of Black achievement in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Thompson, can this quilt speak to us today with its message stressing knowledge, belief in heritage, and hope for the future?
Yes, it speaks to us in a lot of ways. The excellence aspect of that's always been a part of Black community, in seeing just a beautiful demonstration of culture and aesthetic, of skill and tradition in quilting. But it also speaks to, again, the consciousness and the knowledge base of collecting the past to the present, that there are some issues within the larger American society that go back from slavery that are to the present. So if you look at the quilt, you're looking at Dred Scott, okay, that's about citizenship, that's about mobility, that's about freedom. You see pictures of voting, okay, we're here in an election year now, we're talking about the suppressing of the vote, the Black vote, women's suffrage. You see issues about education. Those are still issues within the Black community and that are still relevant today. So it's this consciousness and knowledge that these Black women have of the experiences of the Black community and of the larger American society that Black women are uniquely positioned to speak about, kind of as people who are in this in-between role of both the Black community at large and women in particular. And they're kind of demonstrating to us that there are issues that are still relevant. And here's a way in which that we can speak to those issues through this quilt, demonstrating excellence, the variety of cultural expressions within the Black community, and just kind of an understanding of the plight of American society with regard to the strivings and resistance that Black people have to overcome in American society because of white racism against the Black community and Black women in particular.
Mhm. And Mary Cross, your concluding thoughts, please. This quilt certainly speaks to textiles as an important medium of communication. Would you not agree?
Oh, I totally agree. And what I would like to propose the idea of one having an entry in the Oregon Encyclopedia regarding this quilt. And then also I've promoted it to the Carolyn Mazlumi, who is a leading Black quilt historian and exhibition curator today, to hopefully encourage her to include it and showcase it in some of her future work. I know she's going to be focusing on African-American history, and this is a classic example.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, and thank you, Sylvia Gates Carlisle. On behalf of Portland Textile Month, thank you to our audience, our panelists, and to Oregon Historical Society for making the quilt available to see even briefly, and for hosting this webinar. Since the quilt itself will not be on display, I'm nevertheless happy to say that Portland Textile Month has planned a virtual exhibition of the quilt to be launched on Saturday. It will include close-ups of all the quilt's blocks with descriptions from the original pamphlet like we saw today. Portland Textile Month's events and workshops throughout the month do continue, and all you need to do is check portlandtextilemonth.com for further information. One other thing we never did define is what a quilt is. Mary, I suppose while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, you could certainly talk a little about that.
Well, traditionally, a quilt is a textile sandwich, layers held together by thread. And each quilt, of course, has its redeeming value. And this, I think we've done an outstanding job of commemorating the quilt and celebrating it. And thank you.
Great. Isa, I'll throw it back to you. Let's see what we have in the way of questions.
Perfect. So our first question is, if this quilt was done again today, having the knowledge of where we are today in 2020, what do you think the blocks would look like?
Oh, that's a hard one. Who wants to take that?
Oh, I would just encourage that questioner to go online and look at the quilts that are currently on exhibit in Minneapolis at the Textile Center there. They were an exhibition brought together by Carolyn Mazlumi in 2 weeks' time. She had over 400 entries submitted to this quilt exhibition celebrating Blacks in Black history.
I think there are lots of different themes that you can see in Studio Quilt producing today. Climate change is a real issue, migration, family, transportation from here to there, gender challenges. Quilts today express everything that you read about in the paper and can think about in your life.
And from the Black community, you think about the issues that we're protesting today. So you could easily see something with Black Lives Matter. You could either see a quilt about, police brutality. You might think of some of the people, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. They may be on quilts. And then you may see, various things of protest, things against white supremacy. There may be all sorts of things, and as well as the ways in which Black people have been expressing their advancements in society. President Obama could be on there. Other things that Black youth are doing and accomplishments that are happening. So there's a range of things, but I would say many of the issues that are happening today around protest and around Black activism would be on there today. But you can see that even within this quilt, that a lot of those same issues could be passed over and kind of reformulated into a quilt speaking of the same thing. So, what is the Dred Scott decision about mobility and citizenship of today? What is the voting rights, issue of today? All of those things could be transferred over.
I think think that's what to me is sort of interesting, is that there would be a few blocks changed or added, but what's fascinating is after 40 years, most of the content is still relevant.
Yes, definitely.
And
Agreed.
not only relevant from a reflecting on history, but relevant about the work we need to do today.
Yes.
And that's what's interesting after 40 years.
Dr. Carlisle, someone wants to know if you still participate in quilting today.
I do some other kind of need. I have a collection of projects in quilting, and I think this is inspiring me to
does anyone know of any groups that currently exist that do this kind of work still?
Well, they're all over the country. They are all over the country. People are defining projects and evolving them into the quilts. There are organizations like the American Quilt Study Group, the SAQA, the Studio Art Quilters of America. On Wednesdays, there is a program called the Textile Talks, and anyone who's interested can go online and find out those talks and be brought up to current on what's happening.
Okay, some folks made comments in the chat letting us know that there's the Social Justice Sewing Academy, and there's also the Women of Color Quilt Network that you can learn about. Could you all speak to any traditions that you have in your family around quilting?
That one of my great aunts, in that she's from Portland, but originally from Florida, lived in Portland for most of her adult life and recently retired in Arizona. She's a quilter, and I was going to ask Mary about this, but she had design, what they used to do when she was growing up in Florida, she called them breeches quilts, where they would use like pants and make quilts out of them. And I just thought that that was so amazing. She said, these are breeches quilts. I'm like, what? She's like, breeches quilts. I'm like, what's that? So they would take pants, breeches, you know, that term, and they would sew those together, which kind of just speaks to just like kind of the practicality regarding quilting. Is like, okay, they didn't have a lot of material around, so they would just use old scraps, which a lot of people do with quilts. And so, but they did these with pants in particular. And she called them breeches quilts. Never had heard of that before until this past summer when I was visiting her. I thought that was funny.
That is a classic example. That's a classic example of reuse, recycle, repurpose, which is the theme of this textile month. Yes, you would take the worn out jeans, you'd cut out what was salvageable, and then you'd stitch it into a quilt.
Well, my mother did quilting in other venues, and when she was living in Japan with my father during the occupation, she made a large patchwork quilt that I have. I'm inspired to hang on the wall because it's a beautiful design of stars, North Stars, that she designed while she was living in Japan. And this has inspired me to work on I have a bunch of ties, my father's ties. And so I always said I was going to do a project with his ties that will have to come out of the closet and for me to get working, because it's a legacy of things of the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this same aunt of mine too talked about in Florida that my great grandmother had a loom that they had built, and they all trained on that, and that was kind of passed down through the family of how to even work a loom, where they would make kind of I guess Mary, you could speak to this, like a knitted quilt. I'm not sure because I know nothing about it, but I was just remember having a conversation about this loom that they had within the family and how it was that they learned how to work that to create a quilt too.
Yes, you would take the product from your loom, a square, a rectangle, whatever size it was, and then you would piece it together and create the quilt.
Okay, we have a technical question. What is the quilting pattern on the quilt, and is it hand or machine quilted?
Well, I have to speak to this. One of the issues with COVID and of course, the whole atmosphere of these days is that the quilt has not been accessible for close study. Whether 2 feet away, you can really give a careful analysis of it, I think is doubtful. But it appears to be machine made, although that is the pieces would be fitted together by machine. But I believe the work within the blocks is probably done by hand. It's conceivable that the stencil part, Mary, you could speak to this, is done by machine since it requires a small zigzag back and forth. So I think it's a combination, as many quilts are.
Yes, working remotely from Lopez Island, I wasn't able to get to visit the quilt before we started. But the stenciling looks like it had, the stitching has been embellished by hand over the tops of the letters. The quilt is probably machine pieced, and the quilt, hand quilting, it's hard to tell at a distance to what degree there is. And as Sheridan said, Mrs. Gates celebrated those women who spent a great deal of time quilting and binding the quilt, which meant that's often the level in which it's really difficult to get a project finished because everyone's lost interest or moved on to something else. And so acknowledging that the amount of quilting, Mrs. Gates had what she called the quilting engineers, who were sort of in charge of seeing that the thing got completed.
Okay, so I want to be aware of the time is 1:03. We are currently over time. I would just like to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for talking about this. There's a lot of comments just saying thank you, showing appreciation. You definitely started a great dialogue around this. Before we end, I do want to bring our Deputy Museum Director on to give a brief update about the current status of the quilt, which I'm sure the quilters themselves will also appreciate hearing, or the panelists themselves. All right, go ahead, Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm the Deputy Museum Director. I've been trying to answer some questions in the chat box. Thank you to all of our presenters. Some of you I know personally, some of you I hope to know. The quilts, I am just so pleased that it was returned to us on Monday morning very early. It was very wet. There's significant color bleed, but other than that, it is intact. And so right now, in fact, today, I've been reaching out to some conservators, one of which is attending this panel, I should say. And so I'm really hopeful that we will have the attention that it deserves paid to it, and that we can return it to the beautiful state it was in right before October 11th. And if there's further questions, I'm happy to answer them. But we have been working to stabilize it and are awaiting more information from a conservator to move forward.
Well, with this vast audience who's attending this presentation, I'd like to encourage people, if they'd like to make a contribution to the restoration, they could do that by contacting or sending a check or whatever to OHS in Portland, Oregon. Check the website for the address.
I didn't even ask her to do that. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
You know, I will say that we want people to know that we do have an insurance policy. The insurance will cover conservation. Insurance doesn't cover other things like my time. The curator of collections is also present on the panel, Helen, although she's shy. So, you know, if you would like to contribute to the work that we do, we definitely appreciate it. But we will, no matter what, take very good care of the quilt.
And with that, it brings the end of today's session. Sheridan, would you like to say a few last words?
Check portlandtextilemonth.com. It shows you how important textiles are in Portland and what diversity of expressions in textile work we see here. And of course, a lot of them you can find in the collection of Portland Oregon Historical Society in different ways.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.